Congressman, this is the first time that you've chaired this committee.
Mm-hmm.
What are your priorities? What's your vision?
Well, everybody wants to talk about oversight, and that's certainly something that we're, hyper-focused on. That's our primary mission. And then the things that we weave in the course of engaging in oversight, get a better understanding of how the IC operates, what are the different IC elements' responsibilities. There are some 18 agencies that comprise the IC writ large, and so we're engaged with all of them in some form or fashion, and the missions that they're responsible for, the jurisdictions that they have, and so on. So oversight is a primary reason that we exist.
And you previously said we want to trust our intelligence community. We need to trust our intelligence community. So what is a day like leading this committee?
To give you a little bit of perspective, last Congress I served on 4 committees, including intelligence. I wasn't the chairman, but I spent at least half of my time on intel. As committee chair, now I'm spending about 90% of my time. Usually start the day down there in the secure space. I try to engage with the staff as much as I can, the other members and so on. I feel like I have to know more than my colleagues do to be a good chairman. There's folks on the committee who have really high-quality members. In their respective subcommittees and so on, they're going to know more than I do. But it's a goal I have to be able to talk intelligently with each one of those members about their subcommittees, their lanes, their jurisdiction, their assigned areas of responsibility, and so on, so that they feel like I can relate to what they're dealing with and the responsibilities that they have.
And it comes at an increasingly complicated moment in the globe. This is a job that is never ending, and I'm imagining you getting phone calls too from people inside CIA, NSA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. You're also communicating with those 18 agencies.
Yeah, and you try to be as at least I try to be as candid with and available to the principals of those agencies as I can be. Now, the good news is, 2 of those principals, John Ratcliffe, who's the CIA director, and Tulsi Gabbard, DNI, those are former colleagues. And I know them. They have my cell number. We have a relationship that predates this.
Right, because both Ratcliffe and Gabbard were lawmakers previously. So what are your greatest concerns today when it comes to threats that the homeland is facing?
It's 2 things, and they're certainly adjacent to each other. One of them is our counterintelligence posture here at home with regard to protecting the homeland, and the other is the China threat that's pervasive, not only in the homeland and in the CI space, but also their presence in the Western Hemisphere and what the challenges that presents to our national security and to our partners in our neighborhood. That's a real big problem, and those are the 2 issues I think that I probably concentrate on the most.
So let's break both of those down. Counterintelligence threat, domestically, where does the United States need to be stepping up?
Well, so, our open society is a blessing. It's also a big challenge. It's a challenge for us from a security perspective in engaging with, or understanding and dealing with the Chinese threat, the Russia threat, the North Korea, the Iran threat, that they exploit that vulnerability. Because we're a free people, we're an open society, it's been relatively easy to access the institutions that they feel like they want to access, potentially target. And in contrast, it's difficult for us to operate, for example, in China or Russia in the same way. We're very open. It's a blessing and a curse at times, depending on your perspective. And so we have to, I think, do a better job of identifying those threats, closing those gaps, shoring up those weaknesses and vulnerabilities through a counterintelligence presence that is much more aggressive than it is now.
So what's your take on revoking Chinese students' visas to prevent espionage on college campuses, university campuses? The other side of that coin is that sometimes the FBI and CIA also recruit those students.
Right. So I think that move is, in my opinion, is a good move, and I can give you a couple examples. For the last 20 odd years, well, I mean, probably even longer than that, probably even back when I was in college, there were a lot of Chinese students. Institutions around the country, colleges around the country have a significant number of Chinese students. And, now universities, they sort of like that because this is easy money. I mean, they can charge out-of-state tuition. They can bring these students in significant number.
There's also a spirit of collaboration that academia talks about.
And that's fine from an altruistic perspective. Sure, I get it. But when you see the evidence that shows that, for example, these Confucius Institutes that have popped up not only here in the United States but around the world, in fact, one that just was announced in Honduras within the last week, that's the challenge, and that's the threat that's present when you start talking about academic institutions and their vulnerability. So it's not just the United States, but it certainly is a problem here. And so, the Chinese Communist Party might recruit individuals, or they might already have individuals that come and matriculate at a given institution for the express purpose of espionage, whether that be stealing research. I'll give you one that really hit home for me, was rice research in the state of Arkansas. Now, you might not know, but Arkansas is the number one rice producing state in the nation. In fact, half of the U.S. rice crop is produced in my district. Consequently, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of proprietary information, and a lot of research. 2 Chinese nationals were caught stealing that information right before they boarded the plane. The FBI caught them. Now, I say that, and then I fast forward a little bit. We just had another case of potential agro-terrorism in another academic institution in Michigan. And it was a fusarium virus, or some sort of a plant virus, that was being handled by 2 Chinese nationals in a university setting. So again, we see the decisions to revoke Chinese visas. The evidence is abundant that that's a good decision.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that case?
This is a very volatile, I'm not sure if it was a fungus or something, but it could cause widespread crop damage and easily transmittable and things of this nature. A lot of research done on it in China, but there were 2 Chinese nationals that have since been taken into custody within the last, I think, maybe 2 to 3 days. I don't want people to think that what we're trying to do is create sort of this Jason Bourne in a cotton field scenario. That's not what this is about. This is about subject matter expertise and being able to tap that in a way that you have the appropriate cleared personnel. An example is USDA, that has the relationship with an IC element, whether that be the CIA or the FBI from a counterintelligence perspective or whatever, so that they can provide the necessary technical expertise and the insights that help inform the intelligence community, and then whatever action is necessary, they can execute on that.
And what was the other area that you said was a major priority? I believe it was it China abroad?
Our hemisphere
Mm-hmm.
is for the last 20 years plus, post 9/11, we changed our posture almost immediately, but then it became really, really important that we reposition assets and resources to address the global war on terror. And unfortunately, a lot of those assets and resources were sort of reallocated, repositioned from the Western Hemisphere. And they were never really covered down on, if you will. I mean, so we are just now sort of starting to build back, if you will, in the hemisphere. Why that matters. I mentioned this early on. Everybody on the committee has an assigned AOR, area of responsibility. So there's a geographic area that each member is responsible for learning and covering. Mine, since the time I got on the committee, has been Western Hemisphere, which I asked for, actually, really bargained for. I tried everything I could to get Western Hemisphere because I saw this as a problem, and have traveled quite a bit. And I've met with heads of state in many, many countries in the Western Hemisphere, and they will all tell me, and they all have, that you are our preferred partner. And then in the same breath, they'll tell me, but we just signed a deal with China, a trade deal, BRI, 5G with Huawei, any number of things, a bridge, a port deal, any number of things that allows the Chinese Communist Party a foray into that economy. But we're your preferred partner. Yeah, but you're not giving us any options. So we need to identify where we can provide alternatives so that the preferred partner, the United States, is actually present in their economy and showing that we are a good partner. It's not just about a military cooperation or a counter-narcotics approach, but it's other issues that we have to talk about. It's economic issues. It's the port in Dominican Republic that matters to us because it's in such close proximity. We don't need another Djibouti in our backyard.
I think there are some people who very much agree with that, but would also be curious as to why so many State Department offices are closing that would focus on some of those issues.
Well, and that's a good question, and one that needs some reasonable answers. The good news is I see Secretary Rubio as someone who totally understands that, and one of the first trips that he took was to Central and South America to basically reassure those countries. And why that matters is because technology is changing, the economics are changing in countries like Suriname and Guyana, which are now becoming oil rich. Guyana is the third fastest growing economy in the world, and it's this huge infusion of wealth. They've got to learn how to manage it, and it basically puts a target on those countries. And so you've got China that's driving strong to try to really capitalize on what could be an economic juggernaut in the northeastern South American continent, in Guyana and Suriname. And what they would really like to do is create a Caribbean lake using those Caribbean islands. We're down to just a very few who have not expelled their Taiwanese diplomats. There may be one or two that have held on to that. But that's the first foray into the relationship with China, is they leverage that into, if you'll expel your Taiwanese diplomats, then we can play in your sandbox and we'll do all these economic investments and all these other kinds of things. And that's enticing to small countries that need a little bit of economic help.
So essentially, it's looking at other pieces of the puzzle in trying to understand where China is putting its influence and stopping them from doing that by putting resources into those areas.
Right.
It's an interesting argument. You'd also mentioned counter-narcotics, and this administration has very much prioritized cartels and transnational criminal groups. And I'm wondering whether that is a bigger threat to U.S. national security than some of these other issues that we're discussing. The influence of China, what we're right now in the midst of negotiations with Iran, and whether or not they should be allowed to enrich their uranium. The war is still raging in Ukraine, with Russia now saying it will retaliate after an unprecedented drone attack on Russia's airfields. Is the conversation around counter-narcotics and migration just as important as what we're discussing here?
It is. It's almost a triage. The first consideration has to be proximity. That's our southern border, and those cartels. There are several, but the big ones operate pretty much with impunity on their northern border, our southern border, and the evolution of these cartels is something to note. So it used to be somewhat just sort of almost like gangs, and over time, going back to the late 70s, early 80s, and to now, they have evolved into criminal enterprises who have diversified their portfolio. Like any criminal enterprise, they seek to legitimize. That gives them an opportunity to now embed into legitimate businesses and government, makes it more difficult to challenge them. They've got so much money that they can now invest in technology and use that against countries like the United States, for example, when they're trying to get across the border. They've diversified their portfolio. It's not just about cocaine or marijuana or meth. Now it's about other types of things that they can smuggle, for example, human trafficking, fentanyl. Fentanyl is a big, big problem. Now we got to bring China into the mix because those precursor chemicals are sourced from China. So you can see that, yes, the proximity is an immediate consideration because they're so close, but they're getting help from places like China, and they have a direct result in the fentanyl deaths that have taken place here over the last 8-10 years, and getting worse and worse every year up until I have to give President Trump credit for locking down the border. We've seen those numbers fall off. It's easy to explain. You shut down the border, you're going to see those fentanyl deaths start to tail off, and that's what's happened.
Mm-hmm. But I'm still trying to understand the linkage with migrants, because that's not something that's clear yet. Would it be helpful for the United States to declassify intelligence that it has on people who have been deported as a matter of transparency when it says that this person is from Tren de Aragua or this person is from MS-13?
Yeah, I think that you probably could and have to be addressed on a case-by-case basis depending on the nature of what they were here for, what they were involved in, the nature of their criminal cases against them, and so on. So I'll defer to the executive branch, and the president has authority for declassifying, and I don't. The DNI has that authority, and I don't. So I'm not going to speculate on how they might declassify information for the purposes of trying to create a degree of transparency, which we certainly advocate for, but understanding that it's a delicate balance.
There's also a new subcommittee on open source intelligence.
Right.
Tell me about what that committee is doing.
This is really new because we had historically functioned with 5 subcommittees, but under the rules we had the authority to stand up another subcommittee, and I recognized that I felt like OSINT was sort of being, open source intelligence sort of being short shrift on this deal. I mean, I think that it has come into its own as a discipline, even though there was not necessarily specific doctrine or tradecraft governing the collection of OSINT. It's been around since time began, and it's been relied on heavily, although it's not the sexy, collect that we hear about, the HUMINT, the SIGINT, those kinds of things, but it's so important, and I'll give you a good example of what's taking place on the battlefield in Ukraine. You have young people that are engaging in social media as they're fighting a war and sharing information on various social media platforms. That's just one example of OSINT Collect that can be very informative to either side of that equation. And you know that the intelligence services in both parties are using open source intelligence to help inform better decision making as it applies to real-time collection. Yes, they're using other collection means as well. That's never going away. But I think our goal was to sort of elevate OSINT to an organized, recognized collection discipline, and how we structure it and manage it in a way that we can get the most and best out of it so that it better serves the intelligence community and leads to better outcomes and better decision making. And by the way, 25% of the president's daily briefing is OSINT derived.
Wow.
That's a significant amount of information that is OSINT collected. And it's what you do with it and how you synthesize that information and weave that into the total intelligence picture that I think is so important.
I didn't know that a fourth of the president's daily brief was from open source intelligence.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how that plays out when the United States needs to go to war someday, if open source intelligence plays a major role in that. So right now we're seeing a lot of intelligence-related matters popping up in the news, and I wanted to get into some of it. Do any of the cuts in the intelligence community concern you?
So far, and we've had some hearings on this. In fact, while we're speaking, I know they're conducting budget hearings right now at the subcommittee level over there in the SCIF. So this is being addressed now, but the initial reports we've gotten back from the IC, it's not having an impact. We were not given reconciliation instructions as chairman. That would have been my responsibility, and was more than willing. Because certainly we can do better in terms of managing this finite resource that is taxpayer-funded dollars. But as it stands right now, reconciliation has had very little impact on the IC enterprise. What we have done is trying to do less, trying to do more with less, and trying to leverage what we can, do better. And be better stewards is really indicated across the government.
There was that IT specialist at the Defense Intelligence Agency who was recently arrested. He was going to provide information to a friendly government, and he, according to the Justice Department, he didn't want money, he wanted citizenship. There have been a lot of concerns about counterintelligence based on the changes that we're seeing in the intelligence community during the Trump second term. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is, and you've probably heard this term as someone who's covered the intelligence community, and that is MICE: money, ideology, compromise, or ego. This guy was motivated by ideology, but he had enough of an ego to think that he could pull this off, which was pretty stupid on his part. This brings us back to CI posture, insider threats. What are we doing to address that? We need to be more diligent and recognize that had this not been a friendly service, maybe there could have been some damage done.
For the disgruntled, terminated employees who don't necessarily go to a friendly government, are you concerned about that?
Sure. I mean, insider threats are always a concern, and we address that, which is exactly sort of underscores the point about making sure that we are improving and our CI posture all the time, and this is probably a good example of okay, we dodged a bullet on this one. We just don't want to see that repeated with an unfriendly service.
Right. Yeah. I just wonder if all of these terminations increase that threat.
Well, I'm not sure how many terminations there were in the IC, and so that's the other thing. We talked about Doge cuts and all this other stuff through reconciliation, and the reports that we got back was that this was not materializing.
What are your thoughts on the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, removing staff at the National Intelligence Council? This was after declassified intelligence that Venezuela's government was likely not directing Tren de Aragua inside the United States, which undermined President Trump's reason for invoking the Alien Enemies Act to deport undocumented immigrants. What are your thoughts on that?
So I actually support that decision, and here's why. Because Tulsi came into that role knowing that she was going to engage in reforms and knowing full well that we have an analytic integrity problem within the IC. And I can point to several examples of that. One of the most recent one that I was involved in was the AHI investigation, the anomalous health incidents, Havana Syndrome. And we are continuing that investigation, but we did a preliminary report on that in the tail end of the last Congress. And if you could distill this down to one single problem, it was analytic integrity. And what the NIC did was essentially, define a predetermined narrative and then try to use analysis to support that. Well, that's problematic, and here's why it's problematic: because the decision makers are relying on ground truth. What we don't need is a political bias or an agenda directed into the analysis, because then we're going to make poor decisions. And when we make poor decisions, things happen that could have been avoided or should have been avoided. Did we make a strong case using analytic integrity to send our troops into Iraq? That is an open question. Was there a bias, a political bias? Was there, a thumb on the scale in favor of let's invade Iraq? Or were the decision makers given absolute ground truth without a political agenda, without bias? And here we are 20-odd years later talking about it, and, blood and treasure spent and spilled for a decade hence. Can we do better? Yeah, and we should. And that's what motivated her decision, is recognizing that we can allow bias, prejudice, a political agenda to infect and such an important part of the decision-making process. And so analytic integrity is going to be something that we are paying very close attention to.
And I appreciate those examples. But in this particular instance, critics will say that her decision was an example of political bias because there was a memo and the memo was revised. And now there could be analysts who are fearful that their intelligence assessments could jeopardize their careers. This was information that was very much useful to the president. and it went against what he wanted. So it also could look like politicizing intelligence.
Sure. And I understand that the detractors will say that. There were people that, are basically looking for the administration to slip up, stub their toe, whatever, and they're going to capitalize on that. I'm going to say that Director Gabbard saw things and her team saw things that indicated to her that the product was not as forthright as it should be. She had a problem with it. If they go back and make some corrections or take the political bias out of it, take the agenda-driven narrative out of it, then that's helpful. If they don't, this is a sort of a cumulative effect. This didn't happen in a vacuum. She didn't make this decision out of hand. She did it because she had a valid reason to do it. And we may not have be privy to the information that motivated her decision. I can understand the analysts in question, probably having had a career, felt like they were maybe mistreated, not given a fair shake. I would say she's got a responsibility to not only the president but to the American people as it applies to the decision making that is engaged in to protect us.
We had talked a little bit about Havana Syndrome, or what the government calls anomalous health incidents. And I've spoken with people who have reported having it, people who are representing people who have it. They're hoping that this administration, and specifically your committee, will make an attribution to Russia. I know you're still continuing to investigate. When can we expect a report?
We will have the investigation continues. We'll do a second. We've done an interim report number 1, which implies that there'll be an interim report number 2. I don't know that we'll ever have a final report on this because it's so important, and it don't know how long or what the timeline is to reach a point at which we're resolved or satisfied that we've done everything we can and should do on that issue. But we're not at a point where we can come out and say we can attribute this to X. That we're not there yet.
Okay, so it'll be interesting to keep an eye on that one. Surveillance program 702, seen as incredibly valuable to CIA, FBI, and NSA. It has been used to get information on Hamas, to stop cyber attacks, Russia's killing of civilians, threats to U.S. troops. But we've also seen some misuse when the FBI was searching January 6th protesters as well as Black Lives Matter protesters. It seems to be getting harder and harder to pass legislation for 702. It's up again next year. Do you believe that intelligence agencies should get court-approved warrants?
What I believe is that we need to reauthorize 702, but that it definitely needs to be reformed. And there's a variety of ways we can go about doing that. And what we're going to have to do is partner with our colleagues in judiciary who can look at this from the legal perspective. That's their job, and we come to the table with the intelligence perspective and arrive at a solution that not only addresses the threats that exist and that 702 is designed to address, but also takes into consideration the constitutional protections that we count on in this country. Those two things can and should coincide. We can do both, and we're that's our end state.
And when it comes to 702 and OSINT, how do you navigate the space between civil liberties and privacy as well as national security? And
again, this is where the Intelligence Committee has limited jurisdiction, which requires that we partner with my good friend Jim Jordan, who chairs the Judiciary Committee. We have a great relationship, and our approach is going to be a collaborative effort to address just those issues because they are not mutually exclusive.
And you'd previously expressed frustration that the intelligence community wasn't being transparent. Has that changed under the Trump administration?
This is, it almost sounds counterintuitive to say we need to be more transparent in the IC. But it's not necessarily about, sources and methods and the things that they do to protect us and keep us safe. It's about operating in the way that is respectful of our constitutional protections. It's about making sure that there's accountability within the IC elements. Those are the kinds of things that we're talking about, that we're not doing things that are not otherwise authorized, that they don't have the authority to do, or and some of this stuff, quite frankly, like I said, it seems like a contradiction in terms to say transparent IC, but that's what we're talking about, not necessarily what they do as much as the culture, the accountability to our oversight responsibility and things of that nature, because our constituents, we're elected to represent them. We want them to feel like our intelligence community is not working against them, but working against our adversaries in an effort to keep us safe. That's what we're talking about, and that's our goal.
And last question, as you conduct oversight of the intelligence agencies, is bipartisanship important, and how are you trying to bring that back?
Bipartisanship, let me start by saying good policy is most important. And if we can engage in good, solid policy and achieve bipartisanship in doing that, that is a great win. But we can't sacrifice good policy simply for the sake of bipartisanship. This committee, I think, is functioning very, very well on a bipartisan basis because we're in a space that recognizes that we are equally yoked with regard to protecting the American people. We're going to have some disagreements here and there on how we go about that. But by and large, we're getting along, we're tracking like we should in a bipartisan fashion. But the overarching theme that I have is about good policy. We're going to put that first. And then if we can get everybody to agree on good policy, then we'll have achieved some great things.
Congressman, I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and share your thoughts and your views. Thank you.
You bet. Good to be here.